Hi, my name is Yahav, and I was born and raised as an Israeli and as a Zionist. During the past few years, I've gone through the process of questioning the narrative I grew up with regarding this land we live in and the people living on it. This podcast is about voices of the disillusioned. Each episode is a one-on-one, heartfelt conversation with an activist who supports the Palestinian struggle, telling the story of the journey that led them to see through what they were taught. Each of these people has their own unique path that I believe anyone can learn from, whether you're a Palestinian or a Jew, living here or abroad, or just anyone who feels strongly about this subject. I hope you learn as much as I learned from them about how to build a better future for all people between the river and the sea. Katie is an entrepreneur in sustainability and agricultural sectors and an expert in the Gulf countries' society and economy. Her background is in academia, research, venture capital, and unique governance structures. She has spent many years being active within different initiatives promoting justice for Palestinians here in the land and in other parts of the Middle East. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Av.
Welcome to my podcast.
What an honor to be here.
Thank you. It's an honor to have you. Let's just start from the beginning like I always do. Tell me a little bit about your background, your family. Where are they from?
So I grew up in New York City, to a pretty typical Jewish Zionist family. My father was born in Israel and my mother is, I think, fourth or fifth generation New Yorker. Growing up in New York, you kind of feel like the whole world is Jewish. Everyone, your friends, your family, classmates, everyone around you is kind of part of this community. And my family was very much involved with conservative Jewish and also Orthodox Jewish communities in New York. I studied my whole life at Jewish day school. For high school, I went to a pretty conservative Jewish high school called Ramaz. Yeah, it was a pretty normal, pleasant childhood. I feel really blessed for the way that I grew up. While I had, this sort of very New Yorker upbringing, I also was very connected to Israel because of a lot of family that lives here. And as I sort of came of age, around 10, 11, I became more religious than my parents. We always grew up with like Shabbat and holidays and different sort of traditions. And over time, I became sort of closer to the way that my cousins and extended family was practicing. My cousins are significantly more religious than my immediate family.
Your cousins here?
Here and in the US. I have a lot of cousins.
Mm-hmm.
As a kid, there was something for me in the very like American Jewish New Yorker upbringing that was really missing. And it was, I think I spent a lot of years trying to really figure out how I became who I am. But I think the element of spirituality and community and sort of a connection with a cause that's bigger than ourselves was something that always gave me a lot of meaning in my life. And I always felt as a kid that I was drawn to experiences that were more esoteric in nature, that were more, I guess spiritual isn't really the right word, but, connecting to beyond sort of the logical realm. I grew up in a very logical sort of intellectual home. And for me, connecting with Judaism was a way to sort of come in contact with something that was beyond myself. And so I did become more religious than my family at a relatively young age and spent a lot of time with my extended family members. And I think I started to form this identity of who I am separate from my family and from how I was raised, a lot based on my connection with Judaism and also my connection with Israel.
So like Zionism was kind of an extension of that, you could say.
Yeah, I think it wasn't automatically an extension. Like, I remember being very connected to the Jewish tradition and practices before I had a lot of political awareness or before I really had this strong sense that Israel was my other home. But when I started to spend a lot more time here as a kid, and some of those periods were without my parents, I really started to feel that, yeah, of course, like this is the home of that practice. Like I really started to feel that this was a place where, as the Jews, we're sort of welcome to be exactly who we are. And it was really meaningful to me, especially growing up with these stories of how we came to the US, how we ended up in the US. It was always a story of oppression. It was always a story of running from somewhere and ending up somewhere else. And I think on a lot of levels, coming to Israel felt like coming to a safe haven.
And then when you were 12, you decided to start studying Arabic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can maybe understand at this point that I was kind of a strange, unconventional child, really not knowing where I fit in. But at age 12, I went and did a course at Berlitz and was very fascinated by the Arabic language. And it felt really natural to me in a lot of ways. I think it had something to do with the fact that 9/11 sort of happened around that time, and there was this demonization of the Arabic culture within my own community in New York, sort of alongside this story of the Arabs in Israel that I had been very familiar with as well. But studying the Arabic language, it was sort of the most fascinating thing that I was doing at that time, like math class and whatever, English class. And
This was like an after school thing. You just go to this class in New York for people who wanted to study Arabic.
yeah, I did like a few weeks of this class, and then I started studying a lot on my own. I learned how to read and write, and then I dove deep into whatever I could find on the internet, which wasn't that much when I was 12, but I started to really expose myself to Arabic culture, and it didn't feel for me at the time that it was connected to this conflict or any other conflict. It really was just this fascinating other world that I was discovering. And it kind of was mine, like no one else really around me spoke this language. And it was my window into this other realm that was very private and very exciting. And yeah, it was only much later that I connected the Arabic language to Palestinians or to the Arab world in relation to the West.
And then after studying Arabic for a few years, you joined Seeds of Peace.
So Seeds of Peace is a conflict resolution summer camp for people from regions like Israel, Palestine, India, Pakistan. And I think today they also include maybe some other regions.
Oh, I always thought it was only Israel, Palestine.
No. And the idea is to have a summer camp experience where kids get to know each other and be together in a very sort of social, normal kid sort of environment in the US.
Like they fly the kids from other places.
Yeah, to the US. And there's like an hour and a half of dialogue each day where we talk about the conflict. And then outside of dialogue, we just kind of pretend like everything's fine. I mean, I definitely feel like Seeds planted the seed of activism in me at a very early age, but it also really pushed me very, very deep into the Zionist ideology. I felt like the experience of sitting in a room and having the most valuable part of my identity be challenged in such a fundamental way was too much for me to handle at that time.
How old were you?
I was 16. At that point, I was already pretty religious, studying at a yeshiva, religious, Orthodox Jewish high school. I went to Seeds of Peace. The opportunity kind of came up and I went for it without really thinking about it too much. I, at that point, had spent a lot of time living in Israel and was kind of just fascinated by this taboo thing that was like the Arabs.
Wait, what do you mean living in Israel? You said you had visited here, but
I had spent several months here and there
with your
with
family
my
here.
family in the north of Israel, and had like, my social circles here, and yeah, kind of had built some kind of life for myself already in the country by the time I was in high school. And yeah, it also, for me, my relationships in Israel and my relationship with Israel at that point had a lot also to do with like carving out my own identity and my own sort of like unique story in relation to everything else around me. So I went to Seeds of Peace, and it was an extremely jarring experience. I felt like this thing called Israel and Zionism and even Judaism to some extent that had brought so much meaning into my life, especially in terms of like spiritual and community and cultural fulfillment, was suddenly just challenged in such an extreme way. I remember sitting in the dialogue sessions at Seeds of Peace, just really not knowing how to fathom what I was hearing from the Palestinian kids who were in my group.
Because they were speaking about their experiences living under occupation.
Yeah. I mean, the years that followed that experience were years of very dedicated advocacy for the state of Israel, both in the US and actually coming here and deciding to come and live here. But something that happened to me at Seeds, which has really stayed with me, obviously, for my whole life, is that I got sick. It was during Seeds that I developed my first of several autoimmune disorders that sort of accompanied me until my late 20s, when I healed myself of most of them. But really looking back on it, I think that the reason that I got sick at Seeds was because trying to hold the complexity of accepting myself and my own identity and what that means for me, and the meaning and the joy that my identity and that my community brings for me, while learning that there is an opposing narrative that has truth to it, and understanding that there is truth in both narratives and also a lot of darkness in both narratives, was something that was and is something that is extremely hard to hold. I really think that anyone who's part of a vicious, violent, decades-long conflict, who can see the humanity in both sides, is going to have a pretty difficult life. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So you basically felt like this was like a challenge on your identity, and now you have to try even harder to defend it. And then you started advocating stronger for Israel.
Yeah, I think also just the experience of being challenged in that way made me realize how important it is. Like, I knew that Judaism was important to me at that time in my life. I knew that Israel was a big part of my life, and that I had, like a life there and a social group there, and family there. But I think that it wasn't until I realized that it felt like we're under threat.
Suddenly you hear the Palestinian side and you're like, oh, they actually have like a strong case against something that I saw as pure. Now I actually have to like level up.
Yeah. So after Seeds, I went into my last years of high school and joined the Tikva Fund Scholars Program, which is an extreme right wing.
It's part of this organization that is very, very Zionist.
Yeah. So
it has a lot of money.
So I was accepted into this like prestigious program
for teenagers,
where we were to like choose a topic and dive into it. And obviously, coming back from Seeds of Peace and feeling really ill, like I approached the rabbi of this program. I was like, look, like we have a really big challenge. Like we have these people who are challenging the state of Israel. and they have a really compelling argument. What are we going to do?
So instead of just like listening to it and saying, oh shit, you're like, well, they have a good argument. We have to have a better one.
Well, of course.
Yeah. This is actually, I think, the experience of a lot of Zionists.
Yeah, because I mean, why would I let it go? Why would I let it go and just be like, oh, well, maybe they're right. That wasn't an option. This thing meant so much to me. It was who I was. It was who I am, you know? Like, there was no way that was the end of the story. The next step was, I went and sort of got this like mini grant to do some research here. And I came and spent a few weeks here researching this topic of, how are we going to argue with the Palestinians and prove our legitimacy in the land of Israel. And it's funny because I spent quite a few weeks as a high schooler in Israel interviewing lots of Palestinians about what is their claim to this land. And I heard all the stories. Like, this was like age 16, 17. I heard about the Nakba and I saw the checkpoints and I went to Ramallah. Sorry, Dad, if you're listening, I went. And yeah, I saw the entire thing really up close. And the paper that I wrote was that the Zionist case is really only legitimate if it's a religious one. Because if we're going to make this argument based on historical claims,
we're going to lose.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And it's kind of scary looking back at that because that's kind of where this country is going.
Definitely.
But I kind of realized as a teenager, it's like, well, if we don't have like a divine right to be here, we don't really have like a lot of other things going for us.
That's why the religious Zionism has become the mainstream Israeli thing.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that I always had like my own personal connection to this land because my dad is from here and, I have family here and I spent time here. And that was like, for me, like, why does Israel mean a lot for me? It was always, okay, like I'm also like personally connected to this place beyond ideology. But that wasn't like a good enough reason when I'm sitting across from a Palestinian who's arguing with me to say that like, well, actually this is more my land than it is your land. Like those arguments didn't make sense. So, and I always had to just come back to something that was above everything else, which is, like the good book.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense in like in the rhetorical sense. Like if you want to win an argument. And you have to look for a better argument. Then you find God, and then who can argue with God?
Yeah, exactly. No one can argue with God. So that was my statement in high school, kind of like going all the way to the extreme. And after high school, I came to Israel and joined a mechina, which is basically like a pre-army education and volunteering program for 18-year-olds.
It's like a gap year between high school and joining the military where you have a chance to kind of like live and study with a group of young people your age who are all also before their military service. And it's a lot of like intellectual stuff, right?
Yeah, and I went to a mechina that was allegedly very cutting edge because it was religious and secular teenagers together.
What they call mixed.
Yeah, mixed.
Because a lot of them are like either religious or secular, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that it was there where I really put the whole like Palestinian thing on the side. I felt like these questions of who am I and whether my identity is legitimate, the questions that came up at Seeds, were shelved because I was surrounded by people who thought like me and
that this is their identity as like a default because they were born here and grew up here.
Exactly.
And they didn't even ask themselves questions about that because they had never ever met Palestinians.
Yeah, exactly. And I felt like I really fit in with those people. Like I felt, really comfortable speaking Hebrew, and I felt really comfortable with people who this was their home and they were going to go next year and defend it.
And actually, a lot of the people in your high school also did kind of a gap year program in Israel and then went back to the US, right?
Yeah.
Like this is something that is even almost expected from Jewish kids in the US to kind of come experience Israel in like an immersive way, as they say, and then come back to the colleges and they're expected to like defend Israel because they're like, I've just lived there for a year.
Yeah, I think something like 85 or 90% of my high school came and did a gap year in Israel before going to college.
But they did it like in their
Yeah, within
American
these
groups.
sort of like insular programs for American kids. I went to a very Israeli program, and
because you were special.
yeah, I always had to do something unconventional. I'm still like that, you know, trying to figure out where that comes from. But so basically, while I was spending that year, I received basically a message from the Ministry of Interior that I need to go and issue my passport as an Israeli citizen, because the fact that my father is Israeli means that I'm by default also a citizen.
And this is something you didn't know until that point.
I didn't know that, yeah.
Surprise, you're an Israeli citizen, and surprise, you have to serve in the military.
Yeah, exactly. So then I, started to get these messages about doing Tzav Rishon, which is the like first set of tests before starting the process of the military. And, it felt good to be part of this whole process. Everyone around me was doing it. I felt like I was at home with these people, and I felt like in a lot of ways I had sort of crafted out my own identity that was based on the things that were really meaningful for me at that time. And I went ahead and started this process of enlisting. During that process, a few things happened. I realized pretty quickly into the enlistment process that I was exempt from the military because of my autoimmune disorders that I had developed at Seeds of Peace. It's like everything is connected.
Mm-hmm.
And I was upset. I was like, what? This was my ticket into like, being a
real Israeli.
Like what? So I enlisted as a volunteer. And, at that time I was dating someone really seriously from here, like also sort of a Dati Leumi, like religious nationalist person. And I was deep into the path of like Mechina, army, and, we're all in this together sort of thing. So there was no way I was going to miss out on that. So I began the process of volunteering. And in a lot of ways, I was like a double volunteer because I didn't have to be living here. I could have just left. And even if I was living here, I could have avoided the service, but I wanted to go.
That's how bad you wanted to be part of like Israeli society.
Yeah, and it was so clear to me that if I wasn't going to do this thing, this rite of passage, then yeah, I was never really part of this society. And it was like the counselors and the administration at the Mechina were, all the time reinforcing that belief, like,
the gap year, you mean?
Yeah, the gap year program. We're always reinforcing this belief that, yeah, if you serve in the military, you can, really have a voice here. You can be a contributing part of the society. It was like, you can't be a contributing part of the society if you don't go. And also there was a lot of social pressure to do it as well. And obviously I was curious. But another thing that's important to note, because I do try and be introspective when looking back on these things, there was also an element of rebellion there coming from the sort of American Jewish backgrounds where, good American Jews go to Israel for the year and then they come back and then they go to college and, go into investment banking or whatever. I'm kidding, not all of them, but a lot of them. It was sort of like my own way to, again, like mark out my identity and like mark out my independence in a way that was also in line with the things that were important to me. I think, the fact that I was different from my parents and my immediate family, being more religious and, coming and moving here and being here, all of these things, a lot of it wasn't about ideology. A lot of it was just about marking out my own territory for who am I, how to differentiate myself from those around me, which is, again, something that I still try to understand why I need to do all the time. But I think that a lot of my decision to come here and go to the army had to do with like social, romantic, and rebellious emotions that sort of led me straight into the hands of the IDF.
But before you started your military service, you decided to go live in a Druze village up north for a few months to like immerse yourself with Arabic.
Right. So I think it was about that time where I realized that at that point, I had been studying Arabic for about 6-7 years. It was about that time that I realized that that could really be an asset in getting me a good job in the military. And specifically, I was interested in being part of the civil administration.
Basically, the civil administration, even though it's called civil, is a military branch.
Right.
And people working and serving in it are soldiers. And they basically control the permit system that decides which Palestinian gets to go where at what time. And so basically it means controlling the lives of Palestinians.
Right.
If anyone wants to hear more about that, the first episode of this podcast with Murphy, she talks about her service in the civil administration. So if you want to know more about that, you can go there.
Yeah, so I think I was interested in joining either that unit or going to the intelligence. And
why did you want to go to serve in the civil administration?
Because I think at this point I was really aware of the injustice. Obviously, I had been to Seas of Peace. I had heard these awful stories from my peers.
And you had been to some of these
places. I had
places.
seen the West Bank. I had seen the checkpoints. I was so disturbed by it that I had to, go and write this paper about why Israel is legitimate. And I felt, I did feel the need to be part of a solution. And I think going to the military also had to do with the fact that I could acknowledge that I would never be a respected voice in the society to try and make a change if I didn't go. At this time, I guess there was already some nuance of, there is something that needs to be done here. There is some justice that needs to be, met and served. But at the same time, this is my home and I'm a Zionist. And as a Jew, this is the place that I belong in. And sort of juggling that tension, which I think a lot of people today still very much juggle.
So you thought you were going to kind of like maybe be the change from within to a certain extent?
I'm not sure I would give myself that much credit, but I definitely felt compelled to be part of the solution so that we could keep being here.
And part of the solution was serving specifically in that unit?
I think that I knew that serving in that unit would help me better understand how things work in the West Bank and that I could in the future be part of trying to solve things. Mm-hmm. I think for me at that time, seeing the occupation up close the way that I had really made me feel that if we don't find a solution to this really, really valuable thing, which we call Israel and Zionism, and my identity and who I am is not going to last. And I felt that at that age. And my sort of instinct was, okay, well, you need to become a part of it.
And make it work right, like work better.
Yeah, so that we can continue to live here in this Jewish state. And I think that for a lot of people, that's still a compelling argument today. Like there are a lot of people who, if I talk to them, I'll sort of talk to them the way that maybe I would have spoken to my 19-year-old self, where like, well, this is sort of a rotting reality and smack in the middle of our beautiful country. And if we don't take care of it and solve it, we're not going to stick around here for much longer.
And then you decided to go and live in a village up north where everybody speaks Arabic so that you could...
Yeah, it was like an immersive linguistic experience, bringing my very formal, poetic Arabic to a more spoken version.
And how was that?
The town I was living in, Dalit el-Carmel, was and is a very Druze populated town, which is a minority in Israel that serves mostly, the men serve in the military. So I was sort of surrounded by Arabic speakers who were, super supportive of my decision to go to the army. And it was interesting because the men who I met there, like the men and boys like my age, were sort of on the same page with me ideologically. But the women who I met there were like challenging me all the time. And it was really kind of disturbing. And I couldn't really understand why. They didn't have great Hebrew the way that the guys did. And were talking about this sort of Palestinian narrative. We're talking about the narrative of oppression or racism. And I'm like, what? Like, why?
You're like, what? You're citizens of this country.
Yeah,
What racism? What oppression?
I remember just meeting like women there who really threw me off in some ways. But after the months that I spent there and my Arabic got a lot better, ultimately, neither the intelligence nor the civil administration took me in. I was instead sent to a unit in the Air Force where the only use of my Arabic was holding Arabic lessons for the officers in my unit. But I never actually used my Arabic in any sort of security oriented way.
So what was this unit doing?
So the unit I was in was a drones unit. I sort of started as a lowly operations soldier and basically like being some kind of operations manager in real time.
What are these operations?
My unit was flying drones, and during non-operational times, like when we were not at war or not in some kind of military operation, we would basically do surveillance, a lot of surveillance and, following people, seeing what's going on from above. And during the first years, I found it pretty enjoyable because I really like routine and rules, and I didn't really understand the operational nature of the unit until 2014 during the Protective Edge operation in Gaza. So yeah, for me that was just like, oh, okay, this is actually a weapon. I think it's really crazy how in the army everything is codified and killing someone is hitting a target, and there are all of these different euphemisms and words to basically water down exactly what we're doing. And it really works. Like the first year and a half that I was in the army, I never really thought about the fact that this plane is actually, has the capacity to take people's lives.
These are drones that can drop bombs.
Yeah.
Right?
So we did drop a few bombs during the years leading up to the war. And it was sort of on very rare occasions that would happen. And so it kind of felt to me like, okay, yeah, we use this sparingly and we only use it when we really have to. And I was very like sort of deep into the world of also, ranks. And I was in a very elite unit where when I was promoted to my role of planning officer, I was in the role of an officer, even though I was just a sergeant. I was sort of really validated and given a lot of responsibility and sort of controlling a lot of very important things. And
I think a lot of people feel that in the military.
Yeah, like I was given a lot of responsibility and it was empowering.
Yeah.
And that was more interesting to me than like the sort of day-to-day surveillance that was going on and the occasional bomb that was being dropped, because it felt to me like this is a unit where precision is king, like we know everything that's going on and we only use our power sparingly. And I was really convinced of that. And I had been to the West Bank and seen the occupation, but I didn't really know anything about Gaza, which we were doing most of our work. It was in 2014 when 3 Jewish settler teenagers were kidnapped in the West Bank, which led basically to an operation in Gaza that originally started as an Air Force-led operation and then eventually became also a ground invasion. It went on, I think, for about a month and a half, if I'm not mistaken. And it was during those days where like really everything changed for me. I had seen the occupation, I spoke Arabic, I knew Palestinians. None of this stuff was new for me, but the things that I saw during 2014 really started to create this paradigm shift that was much deeper than anything I had experienced before. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that my unit was probably the most operational unit during that period of time, responsible for the deaths of many, many people in Gaza. And I saw a lot of things and participated in a lot of things that just totally blew my mind. I did not realize that this is what we're capable of, and that the rules in quote unquote wartime are so drastically different than the rules that usually we were following. There was just this sort of like free for all that I witnessed that really appalled me. And at the same time, because I was a soldier at the time and all of my other friends were soldiers, I experienced the Israeli side of what it feels like to be at war. I had two close friends who were killed in battle. And my boyfriend at the time was, spending a lot of time in Gaza in these sort of like secret operations and coming back extremely distressed and traumatized and unable to speak about what he saw and what he did. And I also saw the pilots in my unit dealing with really massive psychological distress after, making these quote unquote mistakes operationally.
What does mistakes mean?
Killing too many civilians. Like, this is a weapon where you don't even hear the sound of the explosion. You just sort of see on a black and white pixelated screen moving like blocks, and you don't really understand what you're doing. You can blow up like 4 or 5 houses and then go drink a beer in Tel Aviv. You can blow up houses and cars and target individuals and not even see the color of their blood.
Because it's all black and white pixelated on the screens?
Yeah, it's a really dark part of modernity that we've created ways to take lives so anonymously.
It's like a computer game. You have the joystick from far away and hundreds of people are dying somewhere else. And you're just seeing something on a screen.
Yeah, I mean, I think drones has changed the nature of warfare, and that's not my quote, but we see it a lot also in the US and the different wars that the US wages around the world. And this advantage is something that has like a deep wounding psychological effect to the people who are involved. And for me, I'm not really proud to say this, but I think it's the truth. For me, sort of seeing the price of this violence and oppression that was being paid by the people close to me and the people around me, I think that's what pushed me over the edge.
So it wasn't like the Palestinians suffering, because you weren't seeing the suffering. You just saw these blots on a screen. But you were seeing the suffering on the side of the aggressor.
There was just so much suffering. There was like, I saw the numbers rising in Gaza of the people who were being killed. And I had lost my own people as well. And I had family members who were also at risk fighting. And I remember just like the insane levels of stress during that time, and watching the people around me sort of like have these really strange psychological phenomena where they were killing people and couldn't really process what was happening and what they were a part of. And I think that this for me was the beginning of my paradigm shift in understanding that there's an oppressed and there's an oppressor, yes. But in the game of war, everyone is losing. And I think it was really like important for me at that time in my life where I knew that the occupation was unfair to the Palestinians, and I knew that it was threatening this valuable thing to me called Israel. But suddenly I saw that the reality that we've built is really just rotten, and everyone is suffering. And everyone is being manipulated. Like, I felt really manipulated. And I think that that's really when I started to have these thoughts about who's winning. Like we allegedly won that war, but I really didn't feel like a winner.
It actually really reminds me of all these signs and billboards everywhere right now in Israel saying, we will win. אנחנו ננצח, ביחד ננצח. We will win together. And all I think about when I see this everywhere is just like, what winning are you talking about? Like, we lost. If you want to talk about us and them, okay, everybody's losing, but how are we winning? if we've lost so many lives,
Yeah.
how is this winning just because we're killing more of them, so we're winning?
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
like,
but it's also like a matter of the Buddhists say that, when I get angry at someone, I'm the one who's getting hurt. Like, I'm the one who I damage myself when I allow myself to lash out and be cruel to someone else.
yeah.
And the Tibetans also say that, they feel bad for the Chinese. Like, what terrible mental state they must be in to do this to us. And it's true. Like, the fact that we are capable of doing the things that I saw happen, the fact that I was able to do those things really gave me the courage to look inside and like ask the hard questions of like, how did I get to a point where I'm willing to do these things and it feels right? And then realize like the desperation and the fear that was leading me to hold on so tightly to this identity, to this thing called Israel, where like, if I don't have it, I'm not going to be safe. Like, if I don't have this identity, if I don't have this place and this feeling of being part of something, I'm not safe in this world. I am the one who suffers when that's the way that I look at the world. And then it's that suffering that leads me to cause other people to suffer. I think it was during that month and the following weeks where I realized that if I am capable of being part of something that is so violently taking the lives of innocent people, something must be seriously wrong with how I see the world and with how I see my own safety. So my time in the army is really what led me to begin questioning the power structures themselves and not just my own side of a conflict, and really realizing that, there are larger powers at play.
Like, other than your own experience as an individual or other people's experiences.
I guess that's sort of when I stopped seeing this as a story of Israelis and Palestinians and more of the other sort of power dynamics that are involved in leading people to kill each other and fight each other for the benefit of whether it's, an arms industry or the kinds of geopolitical dynamics that benefit from these sort of conflicts. Like, my head really started to turn and my consciousness just opened up, seeing the way that myself and my own people, in addition to the people who were under the bombs, were sort of affected by this violent, ruthless occupation. So after the army, as so many Israelis do, which at that point I had sort of gone through the rite of passage, gone through my military service and was now a retired soldier.
So this is like your ticket to the Israeli society was valid.
Yeah.
You had gone in, you're now in.
Yeah, I definitely felt like that. I had walked around the streets in a uniform. I had been through a war. I had army stories. I knew all of the army lingo. And so, yeah, I was definitely part of the club in some way. And it works. It's designed to work. And so I sort of continued the traditional Israeli path where I went on to save up and then go on a post-army travels. And I ended up actually traveling first in South America, but then ultimately spent several months in the GCC, in the Gulf countries, in the Emirates, Bahrain, and Oman. During my time there, I sort of came back into my fascination with the Arabic language and was just like really, really blown away by the things that I saw in the Gulf, and realizing that there was an entire Arabic civilization outside of this conflict and outside of my previous knowledge of the language and the region. And that's sort of what led me to make the decision to go back to the US and do my bachelor's at Columbia University, where I remember sort of approaching the head of the Middle East Studies department and being told that we don't study the Gulf as part of the Middle East. you can go study the Gulf in economics or political science, but the Middle East Studies department doesn't study the Gulf.
That says a lot about how academia sees the Middle East, that part of the Middle East, as
Yeah,
opposed
of
to other parts
course.
of the Middle East.
I mean, it was really that sentence that ignited for me this like really, really deep interest in the Gulf countries and their relationship with the rest of the Arab world, specifically with the Levant and Palestine. The professor who actually said that to me was Palestinian. And I remember like that sort of started a long trajectory of me diving in deep to understand the dynamics of power in the Middle East and how the Gulf countries have had a role to play in this conflict and are still playing a very significant role. But that's not for this podcast.
So you decided to study the Middle East, and you were initially interested in the Gulf, but then they were like, no, you can't study that as part of Middle East studies. So you decided to do what?
So I decided to basically study Israel, Palestine, and I also did a lot of Arabic literature studies, diving into the Nahda, like the Arab Renaissance thinkers, which was really interesting because basically while I was at university, I started to receive the intellectual tools that put words to the experiences that I had during my military service. So these questions about structures of power and their invisible nature, and the fact that, you know, history is ultimately written by the winners. Like these ideas and this way of thinking that sort of landed for me in an emotional way or in some kind of psychological way during 2014. I was now being given the tools to really articulate and understand that, yeah, I'm not the first one to think like this. So for me, I think that I can sort of mark the full circle of my paradigm shift at university. And really, I can remember very clearly the experience of reading Foucault and Edward Said and Derrida and Agamben and these post-structuralist and post-colonialist thinkers that really changed the way that I saw this entire conflict. It was no longer a story of, well, Israel is doing this kind of messed up thing and we need to fix it so that we can keep being here, to a story of power.
And something more universal, because colonialism is something that we've seen in other places as well, and in other times in history.
Yeah, of course. And I feel like it's colonialism is like is one category of what I'm talking about, but you know, oppressive powers that take advantage of different preferences and different identities and different dynamics to maintain control for the generation of capital and for other various reasons is something that happens through colonialism and through many other, you know, capitalism, through a million other different things that we see. And I started to just understand that the story of Zionism is much bigger than just the Jews looking for their homeland. And I think that this is really what helped me see that my own sort of emotional attachment to the identity was also a way of being manipulated to serve someone else's need, to serve a status quo that was very concretely benefiting some and not others. And also, like, you know, starting to see the bigger picture behind the story, whether it's the role of the US or the role really like the defense industry, and really understanding that the defense industry is maybe the most significant player in the story. You know, understanding that this success story of Israel also has a lot to do with a world order based on, you know, the US and American culture. There's like a lot to really say about that. But, you know, I won't go into a whole lecture. Instead, I'll just say that for me, university was really, really eye-opening, and access to thinkers who have been dealing with situations of oppression and sort of dissecting them and breaking them down really, really changed the way that I think. And I think that it really led me to start questioning this thing called Zionism and understanding that as long as I'm not questioning the power structures, I'm going to be serving them. And this was a loss for me. I think that there was a lot of grieving that happened during this time, like a loss of innocence. Because even through all of those years when I had known about the occupation and pretty much stared at it in the face, I still was holding on to this innocence of believing that I was doing everything I was doing for this greater cause, which was my identity.
I also think there's a form of kind of subtle racism in the belief of many Israelis in this intellectual superiority. I definitely know that I was there once, and it was very interesting to meet Palestinians who are very intellectual and very educated, and their arguments are actually grounded in actual, academic theory and not only in their own experiences, which I don't want to like unvalidate. Their experiences are like life experiences are very important, and they're basically what the day to day has to offer. But actually, they know what they're talking about beyond their own experience. They know.
Yeah, it's a really good point because it was like what I had become really accustomed to in terms of my own familiarity with the Palestinian narrative was a victimhood narrative. And I know why that's compelling. It's emotionally compelling, but it's not very intellectually compelling.
Exactly.
And there was something for me about sitting in the classroom with Palestinians who were just as educated as me, if not more, feeling like I have no idea what they're talking about, feeling like I'm just really inferior to them on an intellectual level because I haven't been given the kind of critical thinking tools that I need to confront the topic that we're talking about.
And they have.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that has to do probably with growing up under oppression and learning to question things in a way that I was never encouraged to question things in that way. And also I didn't want to because I was just finding so much meaning in my own experience of identity and belonging. And suddenly, when I was no longer able to intellectually justify this phenomenon, I couldn't hold on to it anymore, regardless of how much it was fulfilling for me on an emotional, psychological level. I just couldn't. It didn't make sense anymore.
This is really interesting because you're describing a certain dynamic in one of the most prestigious colleges in the US. And here in Israel, there's a lot of discourse recently about what's going on in campuses. I know that Jews in the US are very prepared to, go to college and defend Israel and defend Zionism when they confront these young Palestinian or Arab students who come kind of like ready for this confrontation, ready to defend their narrative and their story. And then there's this clash that happens on campus, and we're seeing it now a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I personally didn't really respect these campus clashes. Like, I felt like the Hillel and the Israel groups, but also SJP and these other Palestine groups were all kind of just being ridiculous. Like, I really didn't connect to either of their tactics and arguments. I felt there was a lot of lack of nuance and a lot of this. I guess it was also kind of triggering for me in a way to see this obsession with identity, because at that point, I was beginning to understand that it was my own obsession with identity and belonging and being part of a bigger struggle that sort of led me into this whole thing in the first place. And I really felt like I saw it on both sides, especially in the US. I feel like there's something about growing up in the US where you feel like you need to be something other than just an American. Because if you're just an American, then today that has other kind of political connotations, but everyone is sort of looking for their niche, for their group, for their cause. Like, there's a very big search for the cause that we need to be fighting for and the purpose. And I felt like these campus clashes were just like, everyone is privileged sitting in this Ivy League school, like totally first world problems. And the arguments are just not really nuanced and not really connected to the reality on the ground. I knew a lot of people and had a lot of friends also in SJP and in some of the like left-wing Israeli organizations and in some of the, Zionist Israeli organizations as well. I had friends, and I just kind of felt like they're fighting this fight to kind of fill their own needs. And I felt like I could see it because I was doing it too at some point earlier in my life.
Why am I bringing up the discourse here about the college campuses in the US and in the West generally is because they claim exactly what you just said. Oh, those white students sitting in their privileged Columbia classes, having these arguments and non-nuanced, clashes about what's happening here on the ground where people are dying. And there's some truth to that. But also, you met these intellectuals, and that also is part of being on campus.
I agree. The campus is an extremely powerful place, but for me, the power was in the classroom and the intellectual side of things and not so much the activist side. I personally was just really put off by a lot of what was happening in the campus activism. It just felt to me like really identity driven and not so much about what's actually happening to anyone. That was just my own perspective, having been an American, the fact that I am an American who had found meaning in this identity that didn't have to do with where I was living. And I think a lot of people do that in the US, and it's just, but ultimately I started to learn to speak the language of MISAS, the Middle East Studies program, and, the theory. I started to just feel sort of more comfortable, and I studied with the likes of Tim Mitchell, who was an incredible mentor, and I eventually wrote my bachelor's thesis with Professor Rashid Khalidi about the Moshe Dayan Center here at Tel Aviv University, which is a think tank about the Middle East and North Africa, based out of Tel Aviv University, that originated as a military think tank. And that was really the first time that I came here as an observer of oppression. I spent a lot of time doing research, like interviewing Israeli academics and intellectuals, trying to really understand in what ways their position of power affects the subject of research.
Which is Middle East, here in Israel.
Mm-hmm. After I graduated, I came back here and started my master's studying the Gulf. And, from there on, it was like the paradigm shift had happened, and I started to get very involved with different kinds of activism in the West Bank and in other parts of the country, working, with different organizations and being involved with translation and protests and working with the Forum for Regional Thinking. And at the same time, I was doing my master's exploring critical discourse in the Gulf. And for me, something that really blew my mind was the fact that I had to go to an American university that was, a very significant part of the Western intellectual trajectory. And it was there that I learned to challenge the power of the global North or the developed world or the West or whatever you want to call it. And that kind of was a bit of a mind-boggling realization. Like, okay, like I had to come here to learn how to question this place, which is eventually what drove me to the Gulf countries to sort of try and explore what's beyond this paradigm of the colonized and the colonizer, which is really the Gulf. And I think that it's the fact that the Gulf states do not fit neatly into that sort of dialectic, which is the reason why the Middle East Studies Department isn't interested in studying those countries.
In Columbia.
At Columbia University. In most Middle East Studies departments in Western universities, it's also the case.
But here, you came here, and here it was a possibility to study the Gulf as part of Middle East Studies.
Yeah, but I received my grants from external organizations, and none of the classes that I took during my master's had anything to do with the Gulf. My research in the Gulf was done in the Gulf with American money, and Eventually I wrote my thesis at Ben Gurion University, but I wouldn't really give them credit as necessarily Gulf experts, although there are a few. But I think exploring this phenomenon of critique and the questioning of power structures in other countries besides my own was really eye-opening for me about what I think activism could and should look like.
It's really interesting because we met when you had just begun your journey into your master's thesis about Oman and about the Gulf and critical
Those were
thinking.
the days.
Those were the days. And I remember you telling me about how you're interested in critical thinking. And me, as someone who didn't know anything about the Gulf, but at the time was just like a typical Israeli living, in the middle of the Middle East, but not really understanding what the Middle East is, I saw things as any other Israeli, which is, all these, regimes around us are all primitive and they're all oppressive. And obviously citizens there cannot speak their mind and cannot, resist against the regime. And what's really interesting is you focusing on how actually there is critical thinking in those places, as opposed to what we think in the West or in Israel or whatever you want to call it. It was really interesting because I think it has the power to kind of have a introspective move towards how we think here. Because I think throughout the years, I realized that critical thinking doesn't look the same everywhere. And actually, the critical thinking here is kind of destroyed.
Yeah, I would say that my research did its job,
at least with me.
At least with you. But I think one of the concepts that I explored a lot in my own journey and also in my research is how do we identify this space, which I call the sweet spot, which is basically the area right before the red line in the discourse. So in every society, there's that topic that you do not challenge. There's that phenomenon that you do not challenge, whether it's the ruler's personality or mandatory military service or whatever it
or
is. Or Zionism, or like the ethnic religious hierarchy of a country. And my research of the Gulf was specifically examining critical thinkers that are not considered opposition, that are not considered a threat. So who are the people who are asking questions that are thought-provoking, that are going deep into the problematic structures of their society, but are doing so in a way that's considered intellectually valuable? Because there are very few revolutions in this world that have worked in terms of immediately bringing to the change that the revolutionaries wanted to see. And it doesn't mean that revolution doesn't work. It can work. But there are so many parts of this region, like Algeria, for example, where so much of the critical theory that came out of that country is still being looked at today by revolutionaries and by people who seek to bring down oppression. But if you look at Algeria today, would you really want to live there? Did Frantz Fanon, would he be proud of what Algeria looks like today? And I think it's really interesting to look at societies that did not experience a violent overthrow of colonialism, but have actually developed in sort of gradual, less maybe satisfying ways, but have a different mechanism of change and development. And I think some of the countries in the Gulf, the Gulf has a lot of work to do. There's a lot of progress to do, and I'm not gonna try and sugarcoat it for anyone. But it's an incredible example of a very, very dynamic society where every single year things are different. And I was really fascinated specifically by Oman because I felt that Oman was not sort of intellectually infiltrated by Western thought the way that the other parts of the Gulf. Saudi as well is also very much sort of standing on its own intellectual, historical legs. But really looking at these countries as an example of a way to have a critical discourse that is not
dissident necessarily.
Yeah, not dissent, but a critical discourse that is not entirely rooted in Western academia or the global North's way of defining critique. I think that if we can extract ourselves from this idea that critique has to be deconstructing power structures in the way that we think about them, which is what I learned at university, and realizing that critique can look different in different societies because some people do not want to deconstruct those power structures for lots of different reasons, but they still want to live with freedom and liberty and, safety. And just sort of be more open-minded when we look into those societies and what critique looks like. And maybe we'll find it in art and poetry and in languages that are not English. So yeah, that was a whole adventure for me that I think has really influenced the way that I look at this society as well.
You said people want to live in freedom and liberty, but they don't necessarily want to deconstruct the whole, structure. And that really leads me to think about Zionism, how there are so many Israelis who really want the occupation to end, and they see the injustice and they see the suffering of Palestinians, but they can't let go of the Zionism, of the structure. They don't want to reconstruct that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's part of the reason why this connection between Israel and the Gulf is such a natural one, because there is a romanticization of tradition in this more like right-wing religious Zionism that the Arab world really kind of fits with in some ways. I think there's kind of like a natural partnership between the right-wing Zionists and some of the, more totalitarian regimes in the region, because we think really similarly. And if we can ask questions about what are the effective ways of creating more inclusive societies, I mean, it's a really good question, because today, from where I stand, I don't believe that this place can be a safe and just place for all of the residents between the river and the sea without deconstructing Zionism. I don't think that building a country on the premise of a religious hierarchy is ever going to allow for real justice for Palestinians. And at the same time, I acknowledge that, studying sort of the processes of change in other parts of the world and critique in other parts of the world makes me realize that, this might be a slow process. And we have to engage with those people. Like, we have to engage with the people who are not ready to deconstruct everything, but understand that something here is off. When I meet those people and when I talk to people who are still really rooted in the Zionist ideology and the story of the Jewish state and the romanticization of that, I don't judge them because I've been there. And I also understand that there's a very significant emotional need that is being filled by those ideologies. And the question is, how can we sort of acknowledge what those needs are and learn to address them in a different way? Is there a way for us to make the Jews feel safe in this world without Zionism? Can we dare to ask that question, and ask that question in a really compassionate way so that people can feel like, okay, yeah, you get it. Like, you get what I'm afraid of. You understand that my fear is coming from my own experience. And then, from that place, really ask the question is like, can you really be safe if there is such violent discrimination, oppression, and occupation happening in your name? I feel like that's the real question we need to be asking. Mm-hmm. But back to the Gulf. So it was in 2020 when I had already, finished my master's and spent quite a bit of time in the Emirates and Oman, and to some degree also in Saudi, sort of exploring private sector opportunities as well as my research. And then it was the Abraham Accords all of a sudden.
And you were in such a key position because you were living here at the time and you were in academia and you were researching the Gulf and you were such an expert on it. And then suddenly there's this connection that happens between the Gulf and Israel in such a dramatic way. And like all the television channels were interviewing you and like wanting to hear what this expert on the Gulf, because there aren't many experts on the Gulf in Israel.
Yeah, there aren't. the reasons why Israelis never studied the Gulf are many, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that these countries are not direct actors in the conflict or in the occupation, you know?
And that's what Middle East Studies is about here.
Exactly.
Which is what your thesis was about.
Exactly. So I kind of finagled my way into like a really strategic position around the Abraham Accords. And I felt suddenly like I had bet on the right horse. I had the connections and the knowledge to really do something meaningful there. And at the same time, I was very disturbed by the Abraham Accords and by the normalization. I felt like it was a big loss for the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. And on the other hand, I wasn't entirely sure that this nail in the coffin of the two-state solution was necessarily a bad thing. I've sort of come to feel like the two-state solution is not the most realistic solution to this conflict, and there's like a real democracy that needs to happen between the river and the sea. So while I was frustrated by the normalization because of the damage that it had to the Palestinian struggle, and I could understand why the vast majority of the left in Israel was sort of in favor of just ignoring or sort of boycotting this phenomenon, I felt that as a sort of left-leaning or non-Zionist Israeli, I actually had an important role to play in the Gulf. I felt that we're not going to backtrack this normalization. It's connected to so many things that are bigger than this conflict. Economics, geopolitical dynamics with Iran and the US, for example, and that this is here to stay. And that it was really, really important to connect within Emirati society to the people and the institutions that were passionate about seeing real justice in this land. So I was involved with several different cultural and private sector initiatives that were bringing Palestinian leadership to the forefront in the UAE and connecting with Palestinian leadership in the West Bank and in 48 as well. Also, I had, after so many years of being involved in activism here, I was also feeling more and more convinced about the fact that so many Palestinians who are potential leaders and visionaries, which is something that we cannot solve this occupation without. We cannot get out of the situation without Palestinian leadership. That so many of the most inspiring intellectual people who I know were actually just really bogged down and incapacitated by the fact that they don't have income and that they don't have any way to really empower themselves practically. So I felt like the sort of classic activism that I had been involved with was kind of hitting a wall of Palestinian agency and Palestinian empowerment, and that I wanted to invest more time and resources in bringing more opportunities to Palestinians in the private sector so that people could fund themselves and basically have the tools to be mobile and to be influential within their own societies. So that's sort of when I got involved with starting my company with a few others, which was, among other things, investing in and empowering Palestinian startups and entrepreneurs and, helping more people from over here maintain influence and opportunities in the different Gulf economies.
And the Gulf was very interested in agricultural tech.
Yeah, so that was really sort of the selling point for what we were doing is, talking to the weak points of the Gulf states, which is food security, agriculture, climate security. So yeah, I did that for a good few years. Also came to a lot of the conclusions that I had come to during my studies about power structures and, who is serving what. And, felt a little bit disillusioned at some point with
capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, I also got to see up close the ways in which our economies are really benefiting from this conflict. The amount of capital that is just sort of circulating around the status quo is, yeah, it's pretty nauseating. And yeah, so I'm still pretty involved with these sectors and this work.
And throughout those years, you were kind of living a month here, a month there, kind of like on this
Yeah,
line,
so
like
I
between the
was
Gulf and here.
yeah, so I was formally based in the Gulf for those 3 years, but I was also spending quite a lot of time here as well. And it was really interesting to witness the development of this relationship going back and forth, seeing the ways in which the Emirati discourse and the discourse within the country was influenced by what was happening here and vice versa. Watching this sort of love affair between the Israeli economy and whatever was happening in the UAE. It was a really historical time to be there and to be here and to be sort of part of that relationship. And having already understood the nature of the occupation and the nature of the power dynamics here, and to be playing a role within this normalization it was tricky. I didn't always feel like I was actually being helpful or making things better in any way, but there were times where it was very clear that becoming influential in the Gulf, specifically in the private sector, which is really your only ticket to having a voice in that society, was allowing me to have a platform and to give others a platform to speak more openly about the injustice that was happening here. And for a while, even today, I feel like it's worth it because there are a lot of very influential individuals of Palestinian origin and from other parts of the region in the world, in the Emirates and in Saudi, who are really interested in seeing the occupation come to an end. And I do believe that these people as individuals, not necessarily as a political entity, but that these individuals can play different roles in what's happening here. I also think that if we're, going to dare to think about the future and solutions, the region is going to be part of that. And the Gulf is going to be a very, very central part of that, whether we like it or not. And I understand why a lot of people from sort of our camp don't like that.
I want to go back to like what this was doing to you. You were kind of always traveling here, there, back and forth. You were seeing these two realities who were both very dramatic. You were seeing the situation here. It always gets worse, of course. The occupation just gets worse and worse every day. We know that. And then what's going on there that you described now. But what was it like for you, like personally on an emotional level, to experience those two realities all the time?
It was really difficult. I think that living between two or more realities is really kind of, in a lot of ways, not a natural thing. And I think, it was interesting because I mentioned my health struggles in Seeds of Peace and what it was like for me to sort of see the reality from two different perspectives, both of which have truth and darkness.
And which are both real.
Yeah.
On the level of not who's right and who's wrong, but realities that are happening on the ground, whether we think they're
simultaneously.
Yeah, whether we think they're okay. People don't want to acknowledge, Israel, right? They're like, Israel doesn't exist. And there's actually a very realness to this. Actually, Israel is a thing. We might not like that. Maybe people want that to change. But right now it's happening,
Yeah.
And it's part of reality. It's part of what's happening. It's part of the world right now.
Absolutely. Like, I think being able to see reality from two perspectives that are very much clashing with each other, for me, is a very, very difficult perspective to hold. And it's something that has followed me throughout my life. And actually, about 2 years into my time in the UAE, I was involved in a conflict in some ways that's similar to the one that I was exposed to at Seeds of Peace. And I sort of relapsed physically into a state of illness because, again, like I think that there's something about who I am that I just insist on believing that people do what they do for human reasons. And if someone is struggling for something or fighting for something, there's some reason behind that in the end of the day is very human. And to insist on seeing the humanity in everyone's actions is a really difficult thing to do when people are doing really terrible things. And I think it's physically made me ill more than once in my life, where it would have been a lot easier to just dehumanize someone and be like, that person is a monster. That ideology, I mean, some ideologies are really messed up, but like to look at human beings and say they are not human because of what they're doing and because of what they think. And I think that after Seeds of Peace, like I chose that path. Like I chose the path of choosing a side because it was just easier. Like I couldn't handle holding both perspectives.
I really connect to that. Yeah.
And I think it was only when I was able to really break down this us versus them when I went to university and understand that it's not just about us versus them. There's a lot more to the story, and it's about power, and it's about a system manipulating the us versus them, that I was sort of able to make peace with the fact that, yeah, both of these stories have their humanity to them.
I remember when we were both doing our masters and you told me something that really kind of shifted how I think, when you were like, it's not about us versus them, as in the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. It's more about the people that don't have power versus institutions that have all the power.
Mm-hmm.
And I really felt like there's very big, strong truth to that. Like it's about the power versus the powerless. And there are powerless people on all sides,
right,
quote unquote, but there's also powerful people and powerful institutions that are not really on a side, even if they try to make it look like they are.
Exactly. And this is also part of the reason that we need to be humble enough to recognize the fact that the powerful institutions will always be there, and the people who fill them will come and go. And that any of us can be in a powerless or a powerful situation and sort of play that role.
So it's a matter of roles in a game, in kind of like this big game that's very tragic.
I think so. And you know, there's a story that I tell students when I go and teach about Middle East history. During one of my business trips in the Gulf, I met a lawyer, an Israeli lawyer, who had been spending several years in Doha, in the capital of Qatar, basically facilitating arms deals between Israel and Qatar. And, you know, like there are lots of roundabout ways to do that. And today, you know, we know more and more about these relationships. And anyway, he was going to the gym every morning where he met Khalid Mishal, the head of the Hamas. And eventually him and Khalid became buddies, and, you know, they would have their protein shake after the gym and, you know, talk about their kids and whatnot. And, you know, this guy was drinking protein shakes with Khalid Mishal while Israel is selling weapons to Qatar, which is giving weapons to Hamas.
Yeah.
And we're here on the ground shooting each other. And like, who's the enemy?
So is the enemy them both, or is the enemy the Palestinians or the Israelis?
Or is the enemy the system that incentivizes people to do this kind of stuff? Like, there's an incentive, and it's a very valuable, juicy incentive to go and sell arms. Like, you know, you get a lot out of it. And I think, you know, until we really break down, and here I'm going to go a little bit like philosophical hippie on you, but until we
go for it,
you know, until we break down what it means to benefit, as individuals and understand that we cannot have good lives without creating a healthy collective, then those things aren't going to change. If I can justify my participation in the defense industry by, saying that this is the right thing to do for my family and my kids, without realizing that my family and my kids will not have peaceful, happy, healthy lives if they live in a world where people kill each other ruthlessly, then I'm missing the point. And these systems are going to continue to oppress, and that's the enemy that we need to start to understand how to break down.
It reminds me of this beautiful song by a rabbi who was canceled.
Why?
I think you know what I'm talking about. By Rav Karlibach.
Oh, yeah.
We don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
No, let's not go down
But he
there.
has this song, really beautiful song. Maybe I'll put in the show notes, I'll put just the words, just, very, very, very strong message about, basically he says, we pray every day, we pray for health, we pray for prosperity, we pray for this, we pray for that. And we can pray for those things on an individual level, but we cannot ask God for peace on an individual level, because peace is something that you cannot benefit from alone. It is only real. It only exists if it's worldwide. He says, we can't ask for me to have peace or for us to have peace and for them not to have peace. Peace is something that everybody needs to share. That's part of the inherent, what it means. That's what peace is between people. It's part of a collective. Like you were talking about, we need to benefit the collective.
Yeah.
And yeah, he says some other really powerful stuff, but just that's the main idea.
Yeah. I mean, I think at this point in my journey of, understanding my relationship with this land, I really understand that in order for me to have a really positive relationship with this place, as a Jew, that relationship needs to be based off of this idea of a different kind of collective. I need to understand that my well-being is intertwined with
the well-beings of Palestinians,
of everyone else, of everything else, every other being that is part of this land, including the non-human beings. I am not going to be safe here until everyone here has justice
and safety. Because that's also a thing, one of the main arguments when I speak to Israelis that are Zionists, and they say, but what about our safety? They're always like, but what about our safety? And I have this urge to be like, but what about Palestinians' safety? I know, freedom, self-determination, justice, right? I mean, totally. I'm all for that. But when I'm speaking to an Israeli and they're like, but what about my safety? And I want to say, Palestinians don't have anyone defending them. They don't have an army. They don't have they don't have anyone protecting them on the most basic level of safety. And
right.
I don't think that an army will lead to safety. But even if on that basic level of I want my safety, but what about those people's safety? If they're not going to be safe, how am I going to be safe?
Exactly. I feel like that's in a lot of ways the lesson that I hope that people take from my story, is that I at some point realized that I am not safe and we are not safe. And this identity that means so much for me is not a source of nourishment in my life if it comes at the expense of other people, because then it is not real safety or real nourishment. It's just not. And I saw it, and I had to learn that lesson in a very selfish way, but it's a very human way. The fact that I had to see my own people sort of suffering because they are oppressors,
and your own organs.
And my own and my own organs, and sort of watching the breakdown of my own health because of the fact that we are doing these terrible things to other people, helped me realize that it's okay. I don't think that we need to convince everyone that they need to look out for the other. I think there's something very human in us wanting to look out for ourselves, but we need to understand that ourselves is our own well-being is
actually them as well.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not about, being selfish in the way of I'll do this because it's good for me, but it's understanding that me is actually us.
Mm-hmm.
So this was like really strong, some really strong insights. I want to thank you for giving them to me throughout the years and to anyone who's listening. I'm sure people are having their mind blown by hearing you. But where do you feel that you are today? I want to hear a little bit about what's your relationship with this place going forward. Do you see yourself living here, building a home here at this point after all you've shared? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really hard question, and it's a question that brings a lot of heartbreak and pain. I feel like this place in a lot of ways is my home. Not necessarily because I'm a Jew or because I have any sort of like historical ethnic claim to this land, but because it's become my home over these years. I think all of what I've shared on this podcast today is really actually terrifying for me to come out and share with the world. I know that there are a lot of people in my life who, hearing me say these things, would probably lose a lot of respect for me and maybe choose not to maintain a relationship with me anymore. And I think that a lot of the family and friends that I have here don't really know how I see the world and how I see this place. And that's one of the reasons that it's very, very difficult for me to see me building a life here and a future here. I think in an ideal world, anyone could be able to live anywhere. Like my love for this land and feeling of belonging to this land shouldn't be any different than a feeling of belonging that, a Vietnamese woman has to Germany, or someone from South America might feel about Canada. Like, we live in a very globalized world. And I believe that we should be aiming for a paradigm where human beings can decide where to live according to, all sorts of personal reasons. But I know that that's naive in some way, and that in the end of the day, my ability to be here as a Jewish person is quite different than the ability of a Palestinian to be here, who might have a more direct family or indigenous connection with the land. And because of this injustice, and because of the fact that someone whose grandfather was expelled from this place would probably not have the rights that I have to be here, it makes it difficult for me to imagine myself building a life here unless I was, very, very actively working to change this reality, which is very hard to do here. And I'm not really sure how that can be done effectively.
And also, you mentioned to a certain extent kind of hiding your opinions and your activism from some of the people that you're closest to who live here. And so that would also mean exposing yourself.
Yeah.
In that aspect.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear for me around the fact that I can't really bring who I am and my opinions, not only among my family and friends, but a lot of other people on both sides of this conflict. Actually, I feel afraid to share with them how I really see things. And at the same time, I do have a vision for what this place can look like. And I believe that as human beings, we're capable of finding ways to truly respect each other and accept each other. But the tension between the fear of the reality and my aspiration for what things could be like and my love for everything about this land puts me in a difficult situation. And it's probably likely that I will not stay here and build my future here.
And what would you like the people listening who would be surprised by what you're saying now to hear? Like your family here and people like that. If they've reached this far and listened to what you have to say about the occupation.
I guess I would first say thank you for actually, hearing me out and being curious enough in my perspective and how I see things to really hear what I have to say. And I know in a podcast, it's kind of one-sided. It's like, you can't really argue back to me right now. But yeah, I would say that the conclusions that I've reached over the years really come from a deep love that I have for this place and the fact that I really want this to be a good place to live. And also the fact that, I feel really some strange way proud to be Jewish. I feel that like my Jewish tradition has taught me a lot about being a critical thinker and human dignity and respect. And in the end of the day, I think that being brought up that way and being brought up to have an open mind is a lot thanks to the tradition that I was raised in. And I'm very grateful for that. And the vision that I have for what this land could be like and what this world could be like comes from like a deep love for who I am and a deep appreciation for the differences that we have as human beings, and understanding that in order for us to preserve our identities and to preserve our traditions, we need to fundamentally change the way that we think about those things. I'm not sure whether or not I'm welcome in the society. I'm not sure I have a place here anymore.
You're talking about Israeli society.
Yeah. And, Palestinian society. Not sure I'm welcome there either. I feel like I've come to this point through my own journey and realizations where I believe that any solutions that we're going to come up with that are based on separation, according to ethnicity or religion or identity of any sort, is just going to eventually perpetuate the paradigm that we are stuck in and have been stuck in for decades and maybe centuries. If we cannot rise above our need to separate and prioritize people according to their blood, language, religion, etc., I think we're in a really, really deep problem that we might not live to solve. And I don't mean us and our generation. I mean us and our species, because we have some other very serious problems on this planet that need to be dealt with. And I ask myself whether or not the people of this land, wherever they may be from and whatever they identify with, are ready to ask those questions and are ready to put aside these identities that are so valuable for us. Just also speaking from my experience, like thinking about how I was so drawn into this and sort of the intoxicating nature of feeling part of something. I mean, we need to acknowledge that this is a natural human need, and it's evolutionarily embedded in our DNA to want to belong to our tribe.
Yeah.
And we don't need to fight that. But for us to understand that when we build our structures based on giving in to that impulse, I think we do a lot of damage. And I mean, for me personally, my journey like with meditation and learning to sort of acknowledge why I do what I do, and understanding that behind every action is like some need, is like some impulse. Like, I think we really need to break free of like the shackles of our mind. That sounds so cliche, but we really need to come onto a new level of consciousness and understanding what it means to be human. And I don't think it's so far-fetched, because I absolutely think that we're capable of it. I think there are people who have done it in this world. There are leaders who have done it. There are groups of people who have done it.
Definitely.
And that's what needs to happen here. And I'm not really sure that this thought that is welcome in this land right now. I think that there's an obsession with being on a side.
I also think that there is this clinging on to the idea that either you abandon identity and you abandon culture and you abandon language and anything that, brings you closer to your tribe, and being able to transcend the violent side of tribalism. And I really see that there is a way for those two to coexist. I have my own culture. It is different than your culture. I have my own language. It is different than your language. And still, we don't need to have that be the basis of a hierarchy. It doesn't need to be the basis of violence, control, domination. It can coexist together.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm till this day very connected to my Judaism. I feel that like the Shabbat, for example, is a huge source of meaning in my life. And I love Jewish culture and humor, and I feel like it's in my blood, like in some ways. And I feel like when I meet Jewish people, like we get each other in some strange instinctual way. And at the same time, I need to be on my toes to make sure that like that feeling, which is very powerful and pleasant, does not take me to a place of superiority or exclusion or prioritizing the lives of some people over others. And that's a really difficult thing to do. That requires a very strong mind. And I think that we're totally capable of that. But, you know, this question of how can we celebrate our differences and celebrate who we are without weaponizing it?
Is there anything else you want to add?
There's a philosopher who I really like called Carol Sanford, who talks about this thing called indirect work, where she says that sometimes when we try to solve a problem, addressing it directly, we kind of miss the point that this problem is a symptom of a much larger phenomenon. And I encourage all of us to kind of maybe adopt that a little bit when thinking about the situation and understanding that this oppression and occupation is a symptom of a lot of really deep, messed up things in our world, whether it's the fact that human beings are taught not to feel safe because of who they are and are taught to look at other people in unsafe ways because of who they are, or whether it's the systems of capitalism and control.
And fascism.
For sure. I think the occupation is a symptom of a lot of very deep-rooted illnesses in our world. And we should all sort of just take a step back and think, what would be a world in which there could be no occupation? In what kind of world would this be just impossible and infeasible?
I really connect to that. Thank you, Katie, for everything that you've shared. I really feel like you have very deep insight about you, this place, you in this place, and a lot of other things. If you want to support this podcast and help me keep bringing you these stories, sign up to my Patreon, where you'll also get exclusive content and bonus episodes. Check out the link in the show notes to support this content. And thank you so much for all the supporters on Patreon who have already joined. It really means a lot to me.